First and foremost, good morning to all the students. Welcome to week 2, and let's welcome our guest lecturer for the week, Natalie Yahr. Natalie is a good friend and also my cohort in the J-school. But one of the most important things, Natalie is an amazing reporter. Currently, she is the economy reporter for the Cap Times, and I will let Natalie introduce herself to you right now.
Hi, welcome, or thank you for having me in your class. And hello to all the students out there. My name is Natalie Yahr. I graduated from the master's program, the professional track master's program at the J-school a few years back, and I currently cover the local economy for the Cap Times right here in town. And I taught J335 in the fall semester of last year, and I'm honored to be asked to speak to your class now.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So kind of building on that, could you elaborate a little more on your background of how you became a reporter and what inspired you to become a reporter?
Absolutely. Let me try to make this the shorter version. I always make this story too long. Let's see, the shorter version would be I started doing some radio things when I was in college. I graduated college back in 2010. I got the chance at my college, it was a student-run radio station, and I got the chance to become one of the hosts of a public affairs radio show there, interviewed people about our show was called Local Dirt, Environment, Economy, and Justice with all the fixins. So it was interviews on things related to farming, food justice, stuff like that. Did that, really thought I wanted to get into radio, and then was graduating college around the time of the last recession, and don't know if it had to do with that or the fact that I didn't have specific training in journalism, but didn't find the jobs I was looking for. And I hadn't really thought about this as journalism work or the idea of becoming a reporter, as I just thought like I wanted to be in radio. So I took my career in a whole different direction, took an AmeriCorps job, and then started working in adult education down in New Orleans and taught high school equivalency classes to people who didn't graduate high school for years, and was on that track for a while, and really enjoyed a lot of things about it. But I kept thinking, as I would talk to my students about their lives, how interested I was in that and how I wanted to be able to tell other people about them and be able to do interviews where I then got to make that interview public, because the work that I was doing was very much, you would ask somebody questions and talk through things with them, but it was not for public consumption. So I got the chance to do a project for that job that was about public consumption, that was about telling the stories of our students publicly. And I went out and bought my own audio equipment for the first time. And I was interviewing students, and I just loved it. And I was like, yep, this is what I should be doing. And so to wrap it up, basically, I tried to figure out how to, at that point, when I was in my late 20s, I guess, get into, how could I get into journalism full time? And at that point, the way that seemed to me like it was going to work was to go to grad school. I think I could have taken a freelancing route also, but I just wasn't as comfortable with that and didn't find the opportunities right then. And so came to grad school and got the support I needed to make that switch.
Thank you. It's always great to hear people's stories and how they kind of fell into the careers that they did. So really, thank you for sharing yours. And so kind of really diving straight in, one of the first questions that was asked was, for a really good profile piece or like telling a neighborhood story, you know, that where you're reaching out to the community, how many sources do you think is the appropriate number of sources that you need to tell the story like extensively, at least for you? What do you think?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I will be quite honest and say upfront that I often still think of myself as an amateur reporter in certain ways, even though, you know, I think in other ways I'm pretty established in my skills. But there are some things where I feel like I should ask somebody else that question. I'm not totally sure. I don't know. I mean, I will say that at the Cap Times, I I think we do some great stories that are one-person stories. Like, I think there is a place for that kind of story, a great Q&A, or yeah, like kind of just or a preview of an event, of like things like that are like a person-focused story that aren't like a deep dive on that person. Where sometimes that's the one, person you need. But I certainly understand the idea that like sometimes to get the depth you need or the balance you need or whatever, you're obviously going to need more people. How many, I think, would really depend on how much space you have for the story, the complexity. Um, mm, I haven't done that many of that type of story, but I have done a couple. And I guess I'll toss out a couple examples in case it's helpful to people. One I did when I was, I think, early in my full-time work for the Cap Times. So a few years back, I had learned about this guy named John Lash, and he basically he'd been an artist for years, and he and like a metal worker, and he had decided to go back to school, learn 3D printing and whatever you call like that. I don't remember exactly what you call it, like that type of sort of engineering. And I believe went to Madison College and got trained in that, because specifically what he wanted to do was build tools that like adaptive technology, build customized things that were going to help people with some form of disability do exactly the thing that they wanted to do. So people who had their own business making a certain thing, and they just needed a tool that was going to let them do X because they couldn't control their hands in this way, or just a million different things. And I thought he was so interesting. And that was one of the times that I did a profile where I interviewed him, but then I also talked to like people from the organizations working with people with disabilities about how unique what he was doing was, and the way that he benefited their clients. I don't believe that I ended up speaking to any of the people with disabilities directly. I think maybe, and obviously that would have been a really cool thing. Maybe I did get quotes here or there from them, but I can't recall how kind of verbal some of the people that he was assisting were. But I got quotes from his instructors, and it was a cool way to kind of like put it in context. Here's the work that this person's doing. Here's the effect it's having on the community. And I do think the outside voices did that in a way that him alone, especially because he was a humble person and he wouldn't have said, my work's amazing. So that wasn't so much one of those cases where you need somebody to come from the outside and criticize. In this case, if anything, the people from the outside were saying, yes, this is so fascinating and cool and important what he's doing. That's one. I also did one recently on a fascinating local taxidermist, taxidermy artist, who was just, you can't really describe in a short space what she did and what was so interesting about it, but she's a fascinating person. And by the time that I was writing the story, she'd already passed away. The story was in part about the fact that she was dying, and that this work that she was doing and this gallery that she had created were kind of her dying wish, or like her thing that she wanted to do with the last year of her life. And so then all these other people were kind of reflecting on her and her art and her life. So I guess I don't have any solid answers to this, but those are two stories where I took on that challenge, just like your students are taking on that challenge.
No, that's seriously so wonderful and such really important stories to tell, also so rooted within the community. So I completely get, how it's important to get more than one source to get that depth of the story. So wow, fantastic. And then so we can take both your stories as examples. And so, we have a couple of first-time reporters in this class. So a good question that they asked was, how do you approach, your main focus of your story, like John and the taxidermist, as well as the surrounding people, to become a source for your story? Do you have any tips?
Is the question about how to like literally contact them, like what to say to, or could you clarify the question just a little more to be sure I answer right?
Sure, yeah. So it's how do you contact them? What do you
Mhm.
say in like either your email or do you call them directly? Also, do you have suggestions that it's easier to email or just cold call someone in this day and age? So just what process do you use when you approach someone to become a source?
Yeah, good question. Let's see. I will say that perhaps this is because I was coming from my first experience in journalism being like on a public affairs show that was once a week, and nothing about it was like unplanned. Like you had a guest that you contacted in advance and asked to be your guest, and then you told them what you wanted to talk to them about, and you planned your questions in advance. So I still think in some ways I operate a little bit more toward that end of like, when I have the time, I'm frequently reaching out to somebody and saying, would you be available for an interview, rather than calling them and expecting them to answer right now. Not that that way is better than the other way. I think I'm maybe just a little bit more of an anxious sort of person, and I tend to think that like other people want to mentally prepare for the fact that you're going to call them. So I think my personality leans in that direction, but I have had stories where what you need is somebody to respond quickly. And so then I'm calling, maybe like I'm doing a story on a trend related to, I don't know, people, none of the stores can keep sports equipment in stock during the pandemic. And so now I'm just calling a bunch of stores and like hopefully getting somebody on the phone right then to tell me, yes, we keep running out of blah, blah, blah. So there are some times when I will do like the cold call and hope that somebody will answer my question in that moment. I think that's less good for I mean, I think it's probably less good when you want your person to prepare either factually, like you want them to have certain types of information in front of them, have thought about the things you want them to know, maybe have done research, like maybe you're calling a spokesperson, but you want that spokesperson to have called around. I just did one of these calls today, you know. Um, this person wasn't probably off the top of her head going to know the subject matter that I wanted to ask about, but she was going to make the calls. So um, that would be, those would be sometimes. And then there might also be times when you want the person to emotionally prepare to talk to you. Like you're asking them about something sensitive and you want them to know that that was going to happen. Um, and so I think there are pros and cons to both ways, and it clearly depends on your deadline also. How sometimes I will be writing to somebody and saying, are you available to talk to me today? And then if I haven't heard back pretty promptly, I may also be calling them to say, I needed to reach you. And then I'm always trying to, I mean, the most basics, obviously, you have to let the person know who you are and what you're trying to do. And that can sometimes mean explaining a tiny bit more than you might have thought was necessary. So, like, there are some people where I can just write to them and say, I'm Natalie Yahr, I report for the Cap Times, blah, blah, blah. And there are other people, like, including maybe people I meet out at events in public where I might say, I report for the Cap Times. We're a newspaper. Also, it's a little more complicated than being a newspaper because obviously the internet, etc. But, we're a newspaper. Have you heard of us? Like sometimes I want to do that because I don't want people to just talk to me without understanding who I am. I'm also I think I'm the only Cap Times reporter who speaks a good bit of Spanish. So I'm often the one doing those interviews with Spanish speakers. And it would be very reasonable if a person who primarily speaks Spanish did not know the Cap Times is. So again, I'm explaining that. Explaining what I'm writing about. Sometimes I will send links to stories that I've done. I don't do that I don't always remember to do that, but sometimes if I'm doing a deeper story or if I've covered this issue before and I want to show them that I've covered the issue before, or maybe I'm doing something like a little bit sensitive and I want to show kind of an example where I've covered something that shows my approach or shows the complexity in my reporting or something like that, people will not necessarily click on those links, but it can give them an opportunity to see. For example, if when I was writing an in-depth story on home care workers. I had previously, a couple months before, done an in-depth story on childcare and childcare workers and what was going on economically in that sector, kind of why childcare was so expensive and why childcare workers were still struggling. I wanted to be able to show those sources for the home care story. I'm looking to do a home care work story that kind of has some similarities to this other story in terms of the depth and what I'm going to try to do. I don't know if those people cared about seeing that or not, but I wanted to give them the option so that they could know, because I think ultimately when people, I'm being long about this, but I think ultimately when people agree to talk to you, they're sort of just trusting you. Like they probably have only a limited understanding of what journalism is like in a lot of cases. And so if you can give them more basis to understand what you're doing and to know the quality of work that you do, I think it lets people make a more informed choice and maybe have more of a reason to trust you. Yeah. And then last thing is, I often will, especially if it's not a person who's like a professional spokesperson or someone in power, I'll often just say, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have before you decide whether to talk to me. Or if I'm writing to like a person, an intermediary who's going to help me connect to people, I'll tell them I'd be happy to answer any questions. Like maybe you're a social worker, you're going to try to help connect me to people experiencing this challenge. I'd be happy to talk to them and answer any questions they might have before they commit to talking to me.
Fantastic. Like clearly it's all based on circumstance and also, where your deadlines and how you want to push the story.
Of course. Yeah.
So great, thank you. And so kind of talking about, your guide that you had created as part of your project, also very related to what we've been talking about. So my question for you was, what is the inspiration behind creating that guide, and what really led to your discovery and how you kind of elaborated more on those rules?
Yeah. The inspiration for this, I think that these were questions that were at the back of my mind when I was thinking about moving into journalism full time. And I had been working in, as I said, in adult education. I'd been working like directly serving people who did not always have easy lives, and I think that so I'd been thinking about kind of what is the job of the journalist here, but then there was this one specific circumstance, which I go into in the intro of the guide, by basically interviewing people who'd been shot and survived for a project that an outlet that I was working for had teamed up on. And so inherently we were working with people who'd suffered a harm. And I talked to this one of the people that I interviewed had been very reluctant to talk to me. And then very quickly in our interview ended up saying that he hadn't gotten mental health support when I asked him, had he gotten, therapy or anything to deal with the trauma of having been shot. And he said, essentially, yes, I got some of that, but it was mostly they just give you a pill and not really anybody listening to you and talking to you like we're doing now. And that just raised a lot of questions for me, because on the one hand, I was like, wow, how flattering that he feels like this interview that I'm doing with him is like therapy. Like, obviously that feels really great. And then you're also like, what are all the problems that exist in our society such that this person didn't have therapy? And I clearly cannot actually be this person's therapist. I'm going to be with them for like 30 minutes or something. But it made me think, is there a world in which being interviewed can be beneficial to somebody? Is that inherently helpful to them? Do they get something out of telling their story in one way or another? And of course, I think the traditional way we might think as journalists is like, yes, they're of course getting something out of it because they're telling their story, and then you're shedding a light on it, and then things change. And like, sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. So I just wanted to think about in what circumstances is it okay to ask people to kind of dredge up the bad things that have happened to them, or that are still currently happening to them? And what responsibility do we have as journalists, given that we are not actively fixing those problems? It's not like when you talk to your doctor about your pain because your doctor is going to give you medicine. And so that was part of what motivated me to go to grad school, was I wanted to think through some of those challenges, those questions. And when I was in my first semester, I took an ethics seminar with Katie Culver, and she said basically to all the students that there's a research assignment for a research paper to write for the end of the final project, but she was also like, but I want you to do something that is helpful to you. And so if you're not planning to go into research, feel free to suggest a different type of thing that you'd write that is not a research paper. And I suggested this, a guide geared toward other journalists. And then one note, and so I worked on it during that, kind of throughout that semester, and then got the chance as a fellow for the Ethics Center, the Center for Journalism Ethics. The next semester, I got to kind of extensively edit it and work with Krista Eastman at the Ethics Center to get it all ready to be actually published. I think that there's soon, if not already online, there's also going to be a Spanish version, which has been a long time in the works. I did not do the translation, but the Ethics Center hired somebody to do the translation. And I would just add one note, because I have the chance to. When I wrote it, I have no idea why, this was a few years ago, why I called them rules, because I feel like that was just such a, I still love most things about the guide, but I feel like that was such a rigid thing to say. And that realistically, I don't think any reporter is following all these things. I don't think any reporter probably is doing all these things all the time. And I'd say most reporters would be lucky if they're doing one or two of these things at any given time. Like it's quite, I think the word was aspirational. Like it's where we'd like to be, maybe best practices or something. So in retrospect, I wish that I'd called them something like guidelines or goals or something. But just wanted to say that so that nobody thinks like that, feels bad about the fact that it's really, really hard to do these things consistently.
Yeah, I remember because I think we took that class together. So I remember you talking about it during that class. So it's been so good to just go through it as well, because it's always refreshing and it's such a good set of guidelines, like you say, even if you're not just doing, from a reporting perspective, but even as a research perspective. So kind of really on this, considering now that it's been years since you've created this guide and you've been working on it, and of course, over time reflecting on it, plus your time at the Center for Journalism Ethics and your time now as a reporter for the Cap Times. Does ethical interviewing, or how to interview ethically, mean for you now?
Ooh. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think that realistically, it is a lot like what you said before about how a lot depends on the specific context and your deadline. Like there's something, and on who you're talking to. I think there's some interviews that are a lot lower stakes when it comes to thinking through all the ethics. If I'm interviewing a spokesperson, I'm interviewing, an established business owner, all those. I think those are cases where, I don't feel like you have to think quite so much about, am I doing this the right way? I think a lot of your standard practices that you're probably automatically coming to your mind, or that you trained in a journalism school, apply there. I think that there are other situations where you're talking to somebody who has less experience talking to a journalist, who has more to lose from this interview, who may be running some risks by talking to a reporter, who may be talking about really sensitive or painful things, stuff like that. Those ones are, I think, the higher stakes ones, the ones where one needs to be more careful. And but I just the reality of being a reporter is you have more time sometimes and less time other times. So what does it mean? I think it means to me, it means internalizing some basic ideas, like that nobody's really required to talk to you. Like nobody has an obligation to talk to you. There are some people where if they don't talk to you, they're doing their job badly, or they need to be held to account publicly. If a public official doesn't want to answer your questions, you will probably print in the newspaper that they refuse to answer questions. If you can hear in the background, my baby is crying a little bit, but his dad's with him. Sure. Just sorry about that. There's some people who, they're not required to answer your questions, but yes, you're gonna kind of call them out if they don't. There are lots of other people who, I think the word is like they're in the private sphere, like unless they've done something wrong, like in an important way, like it's really their choice if they want to talk to you or not. And I think that people of the generation of your students, especially, I'm not that much older than them, but I'm definitely older than them. Folks think about consent. I think there's a lot more talk about consent now. We usually think about it in terms of like personal relationships, sex, things like that. But I think that journalists have something to learn from that as well. And I don't know exactly how we should best hash it out, but like basically that idea that I don't think you need to pressure anybody to talk to you. Like, yeah, you can pressure public officials to talk to you because you can make clear that or you can pressure somebody who like you're holding them accountable because it appears they have done something wrong. But everybody has the right to not talk and you'll just respond accordingly. And I think that that's one thing I try to remember. I also try to remember that, like, again, like I was saying before, people are often just making decisions about whether to talk to you kind of blindly. Like, I'm always a little surprised when certain people talk to me, just even not because anything bad's going to happen to them, but because they just, like, maybe you're a brand new business owner and you've just agreed to talk to this reporter about your business, but like you don't know if I'm a good reporter. You don't know if I like write well. You don't know if I'm gonna like get my facts wrong. Like, I mean, I'm sure you're hoping, well, she's still got her job, so like probably she's good, and I am good. But like people are kind of a little bit going blind into that. So I try to just think about how to help them not go in blindly, or just to do the most that I can to be deserving of that trust.
Fantastic.
And then all the things that are in the guide that people much more experienced and thoughtful than I am said. I will do a quick shout out to a cool one pager. I can send this to you. I was just pulling it up again on my computer. It's like a long one pager, but a nice short read that was put out by this org. I think they're a journalism nonprofit, MLK 50, and written by Lewis Wallace, who I interviewed in my guide. It's called Don't Talk to a Journalist Until You Read This. And it's basically like I think it's like 5 points on just things that kind of regular people might want to know before they talk to a journalist. And I think I can't say that I've shared it to sources myself, though maybe I should start, but I think it's a nice kind of, because obviously most people have never talked to a journalist before, or don't know that they've talked to a journalist before, and don't know a lot of the basics about how journalists do their jobs. So I think it's our job as journalists to be ready to explain those things. And it's very reasonable for people to want to know kind of their rights in that situation.
Thank you. I know my students will benefit greatly from it. I know I will benefit greatly from it. So definitely I will look it up and I will add this as something for them to keep an eye out when they start interviewing people as well. So to be mindful of your time, let's just go through last couple of quick questions very quickly. So kind of from your guide, what are the top 2 things that you think that reporters should do? And what are 2 things that reporters should definitely not do? So 2 things you should do and 2 things you shouldn't do.
this is me skimming back at my guide right now to, yeah, okay, I'll go for an easy one first. Don't promise people that anything's going to change because of your story. I mean, we can always hope that that will happen. That would be great. Don't promise it. Don't promise yourself that, again, you can hope, you can be really dedicated, and maybe you're just going to keep writing and writing on something and like really hope that it'll change, but like, don't promise people that. And they should, you got to just hope that they'll be willing to talk to you, kind of whether or not things are going to change, or on the hope that they might separately be hoping things will change, but don't tell them that they will. That would be one for a not do. What's another one? A not do. I'm gonna think of another not do.
If it's easier, we can talk about what they should be doing.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I'll cheat for the moment on this. Well, okay, sure. I'll just go with a should do for now. One that I do really like, and I think it just inherently can lead to good reporting. I won't say that I've done a huge amount of this myself, but major shout out to News 414, the project of Wisconsin Watch and Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, which just like focuses on this all the time, which is addressing the information gaps that your sources have, which, as I think about it now, that sounds quite jargony, but that's basically like, what is the information that people who are experiencing this challenge that you're concerned about, the people who are suffering this harm, or whatever words we want to put on this, what information would those people need? Maybe they're telling you directly, maybe you can examine what's happening and make a good guess about what they might need to know. And there's a great example of this in the guide. So I won't go into too much depth there, but like, it's one thing to report on those people and the harm they're experiencing, and that can be super important, but is there a piece of information those people need? So sometimes maybe that's a great sidebar to your other story, or a companion piece to your other story. And those things where you're basically just answering real life questions, I think those are not complex reporting, and they can be really valuable. Like, it's not going to be the hardest story you do to just try to find out, hey, for example, I'm reporting on people's utilities getting shut off in the winter. I don't know, that's probably not a real thing, but because there are lots of things to prevent that. But let's say, here are like, maybe you want to make a sidebar that says what to do if you're in this situation. So I think that's a great one to do. And then I'll try to be brief on another one to do. I will say the other one I want to say here would be, just one second. I guess follow up. I feel a little bit maybe unfair in saying that, only because I have yet to manage to do really in-depth following up with my sources. But when you report on something where you, like, especially a project you spend longer on, or something where the people involved like had kind of a sensitive role in it, or like they talked about something really personal, at least, let them know when the story publishes. Send them the story, for example. Offer, that they can reach out to you if they have other, things that they think you should know about in the future. Maybe tell them what kinds of things you're looking out for, or that you would send their suggestions to other reporters if it wasn't for you specifically, something like that. There's a whole art to staying in longer contact with people, but I think at the least sending them the story itself, a link to the story, and a note to thank them can be really helpful. So at least, for example, for all my cover stories, I do that. I keep a list of who all I talk to, and then on the morning it publishes, I send the link to those people. And usually they send you nice notes about it. But you do have to be ready in case they had any criticism or anything that they thought should have been different. And the I guess the other that I would say as far as what to not do, I'll kind of hijack Melissa Sanchez's point from the guide and say what you should not do is think that you have to be completely neutral on all things all the time. Like, there's definitely an art to this, or it's nuance, and you should definitely read what Melissa Sanchez has to say about it. But don't go too far in this too early in your career. But we don't have to feel completely neutral about the harms that people are experiencing. That doesn't mean you should become biased in your reporting. And again, there's a whole objectivity debate going on in journalism right now, but you are allowed to be a human and empathize with people who are experiencing, some form of harm or injustice.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So on that closing note, I'd just like to end with asking if you have any just quick tips for first-time reporters, and what advice would you give them? It could be a very short advice as we close.
Yeah, I'm very long-winded. I would say the advice that most comes to my mind right now is really embrace the editing process. One of the things that I just was so impressed with when I first started freelancing before going back to grad school and going full-time into journalism and just doing my first written reported stories, was that the editors, I think I was just lucky and had really good editors, but these editors were going to work with me to make my story better. And I was an amateur at the time, and I was just looking back at the Google Docs of some of these things that editors helped me work on. They really helped me overhaul stuff that I'm sure made it so much better. I don't even remember what those early versions looked like, but they had the patience to work with me on it to make it ready to publish. And that doesn't mean you have to always accept everything an editor tells you. Sometimes you need to push back, especially if you think there's an ethical concern. But I think that that's one of the wonderful things about journalism is as opposed to the other writing that, for example, I would do in school, you get a grade back and then feedback, but it's too late to do anything about it a lot of the time. It's just, sorry, I didn't like the way you did X. And when an editor's giving you feedback, it's because they're going to help you make it better. And so I would say, just try to kind of put your ego aside. I deal with that challenge myself as well. And just embrace the editing process and look for ways that an editor can help you, or even your peers as reporters can help you find a better way to do a certain story. And you'll be continuing to make your work better and better over time. And the cool thing is, when your story publishes, your name gets to be on it. That editor put in that work to help you behind the scenes, and then your name goes on it. Obviously, that also means, though, make sure it's work you're proud of. So that does mean clearly push back if you think somebody's trying to change something to make it not be work that you'd be proud to have your name on. But embrace the editing.
Fantastic. That's such great advice. And it's so important for people to take into consideration. So on that note, thank you so much for giving us the time and doing this interview. I know you have a very tight schedule. We really appreciate it. And for all the students, please go check out Natalie's work at the Cap Times. She writes some amazing pieces. I have actually linked them on our assignment, so go check it out. And I will also link her guide so that people can read it and get a great idea of how to do what she suggests. So thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having me, and students would be very welcome to reach out to me. My DMs are open on Twitter, but you can also email me, nyahr@captimes.com. My personal email is also in the guide. And either way, I would love to hear from anyone if you'd just like to chat.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you.